Okay. Hi there. This is our 10th class. We're near the last we have 4 more classes, then we have the exam. Just remind you, the exam date is, make sure, hold on, I have it right here. Where is? No, you can get organized, you get too organized too much, and then all of a sudden everything goes goo-hoo. So hold on, here it is. The exam date is on June 15th at this time. We will be operating at the thing. You'll have a written test and you'll have the full class time to do it. I want to talk about 2 things. First, I want to go over the previous quiz 5 a little bit, and that is get the answers. For the 5th quiz, number 1 is regimes are simply unitary wholes that are, as long as there remain unitary will within them, or at least the majority of its members, the regimes will hold together. That's false. Why? Because remember, it's nothing unitary. The concept of the regime is not a unitary structure. It's a discrete structure, and it's different parts. What matters, what holds a regime together, is whether the parts, the given set of parts, are maintained and in charge. In other words, the ruling part, whatever part is ruling within the dynamic of the situation, whatever that is, if as long as it has the support and able to maintain itself, it's there. Okay, and what happens is that it will start when its support erodes, when there is resistance, and the regime will have to use more coercion to enact what it wants, then it will start to fall apart. Okay. Or there's pressures within the regime that forces it to change, and then it will change. In other words, so as long as it's not, therefore, it's not a question of mere will of the majority or will of the members, because that would assume that that the regime is a constructive whole. In other words, the regime is always understood as a relation of parts, discrete parts within a community. That's why it's the way it is. That's why it's not that's why the term unitary should automatically, if you hear the term unitary regime with unitary, you would think, okay, no, the regime's always going to have discrete parts. What it would have been if it would have to in other words, would have to keep, if it said lose support, right, would have to keep support. In other words, the answer to this, the regimes would remain in control if they maintain support of the different groups that are within the community. Okay, that would be more of a yes answer. Okay, for that. But how it's written, it's a no. It's a false answer. Number 2, the political communities are composed of many parts that are from their way of life point to different regime types. So any one regime within it exists the forces that can cause a regime to change its regime from one to another if the part of the regime which rules changes. And that's, of course, true. Okay, it's a very complex explanation of how it changes. Regimes only vary among clear types and have very little variance within any given regime type. That's false, because there's also change among regimes types, and within a regime there's variation. There's often great variation within, particularly democratic and oligarchic regimes. These tend to be the ones that have the greatest variation, but also in aristocratic regimes, and likewise. Number 4. Democratic regimes and their variations are mostly affected by the character of the nature of the multitude. True. In other words, the kind of multitude will determine the character of the democratic regime. Oligarchic regimes will not vary much between them, because the nature of the elites that shape such regimes are mostly identical. And this is actually true. In other words, elites tend to be more similar to each other than differentiated with each other. Okay? So there's going to be, even though there might be different ways of life, and there might be some difference, but generally regimes are much more, elites or notables within a political system will have more uniformity to them than multitudes. Okay? Even though the elites can have different ways of life and different, ways that wealth was generated, right? The ways their wealth have been generated may differ, or their status has been generated may differ. But what happens is they tend to intermarry and interconnect in such ways that in a society, the elites tend to be homogeneous over time, okay? So therefore, that's why this is true. Number 6, offices and institutions of previous regimes, if held over on the new regime, will act as a restraint that pushes back towards the previous regime, that radicalizes the regime either to go more forward in the direction of the regime that changed into. So this is actually true. In other words, the old institutions will hold back. In other words, regimes, sometimes the pressure of regime will try to radicalize it. And the old institutions from that came before, that came when it was a different regime, right, will kind of be forces that push the regime back towards those forces. So therefore, the role of institutions, in other words, the role of certain, the English crown. The English crown was once an all-powerful entity. The crown still maintains a function of restraining democracy. Okay, in other words, it acts as kind of a restraining mechanism of democracies in some countries. In other countries, it doesn't. Okay, so again, the institution will depend on how it's being used and how an institutional office from a previous regime, if it's maintained in the new regime, it usually will reflect the purposes of how it was created, okay? And it will move the regime towards that. So that's why that's true. 2, institutions play no role in how regimes operate. That's false. Number 8, the economic character, the ways that it sustains itself for the multitude and the basis of wealth for the elites, does influence the character and direction of the regime. And that is true. In other words, the character of the way of sustenance, the economic way of life will shape the regime. You're going to say, but wait a minute, doesn't that contradict what I said about the nature of oligarchic regimes? No, because the problem here is that it's not. In other words, there's going to be a lot of the variation of oligarchy will not be based upon the type of multitude, or the type of elite, but rather the size of the elite. Okay, we'll talk. In other words, what usually defines the much more democratic thing will be not only the who can participate, but the quality, what group participates, what type of multitude participates. When an oligarchy, well, it's a matter of how much wealth does the oligarchy. In other words, is the size of the oligarchy pool large, or is it increasingly smaller and smaller and incestual of only, the same families and the same networks? Okay, so therefore it's a different structure. Number 9, who is the armed element plays no role in defining the regime. That's clearly false. Who is the armed element within any society will be very much a defining character of a regime. And then number 10, last but not least, the number of rulers is less important than the principle or character they live and shape their way of life. And that is true. In other words, number of rulers is less important than the numbers of rulers is less important to the understanding the regime, to the end or the way of life or the principle that the regime operates under. Okay? In other words, if a principle of democracy is equality, so it doesn't matter if it's a large there's many people in the democratic society or very few people in democratic the elites, the populations of the demos. Okay, the number of the rulers won't matter. If their principle is equality, it doesn't matter whether there are few or many in that sense. But if their principle is wealth, maintaining only wealth, then it's oligarchic. In other words, again, this leads us to some of the points we will talk about here in next quiz. The week 6 quiz had one thing, which was, this was the highlight from last week, the previous week, and that's at the end, and therefore I'll look at that first. Tyranny, of course, is tied to might. Aristocracy is tied to virtue, provide for the virtue in being good or being best. Democracy is tied to equality. Kingship is wisdom or expertise, and oligarchy is wealth and the ability to provide for the city. Those are the principles that are tied to it. Now back to the rest of the questions are about the division of powers and functions of government. The first 6 questions is the typology. The difference between the typology of the 3 parts: decision-making, acting or doing, enforcing, and then settling disputes, right? Or adjudicating. Well, that's where adjudicating comes. So therefore, what is it from? Well, the ancient form is, for deciding, was considered the deliberative offices, right? The deliberative or deliberative offices. The modern understanding of it is called the legislature or the legislative, right? The enforcing of things. Well, this is the offices, doing things, right? Carrying out execution. The offices in the ancient order. In the modern understanding, it's called usually the executive or the executive. And then the settling disputes. The ancient idea is the adjudicative offices, adjudicative branch, adjudicative offices, and that for the moderns is judiciary, right? So that's the division of power. The modern division of powers is legislative, executive, judiciary. Ancient division of power wasn't really division of power, but division of function between what? The deliberative, the offices, and then the adjudicative offices. What are the 2 principles of the question? Of next question is, what is the 2 reasons for why we divide or separate government? Well, of course, one is to avoid despotism, right? That's the modern understanding, avoid despot, or even the Roman, the idea you divide power to avoid despotic rule or tyrannical, despotic or corrupt rule. And then the other one is you divide it for efficiency, making it efficient, making it make the administration better. Okay, division of labor. It's division of labor and preventing despotic construction. Okay, so there's 2 principal structures. Number 9, all regimes will follow the same division of powers or function arrangement. No, that's not true. That's false. Every regime will have every type of regime will have different structures of how it allots and divides the functions of government. Okay. Montesquieu thought, number 10, Montesquieu thought that what secured liberty in the English regime or constitution of his time was in fact the judicial power in England was held in the jury. That's true. In other words, his argument wasn't the court that preserved. This is why I always joke when I hear anyone who says the judges, that the courts should be the true defenders of the Constitution. No, that's the worst form of situation. Judges are an elite, self-serving oligarchy. That they should have the ultimate power to determine this issue would be the least democratic structure. In other words, the jury is what? It's created by random citizens, constituted for a one-time event, the trial, and then dissolved. So it has no permanent interest. Judges have a permanent interest. They're a class, and having a class, they will rule and do things to benefit their interest. We only have to look at the current case of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal member who basically was involved in a traffic death and is using her point as a member of the Constitutional Tribunal to saying that she cannot be interviewed by the police, and any attempt to interview her by the police is an encroachment on judicial independence. Okay? You understand that you have a problem with this? In other words, Judges are not the defender of liberty. The jury is the defender of liberty, in that sense, much as you get. This is why it's one of the misreadings of I always find the KOD crowd very laughable, because they misunderstand the argument of what does rule of law really mean, and what does independence of the judiciary really mean. And why is the judicial such an important thing as the protection of liberty? It's not that judges are the defenders of liberty, it's jurors are the defenders of liberty. Since you don't have jurors, therefore it's completely laugh to think that the judicial branch is a defender of democracy. Okay, remember, what is the most democratic mechanism? Okay, remember we talked about selection last time? If you elect somebody, election is aristocratic. If you select or elect, this is aristocratic. If you choose by lottery, this is democratic. Jurors are always chosen by lottery, traditionally in most societies. And in fact, even in ancient Greece, when they selected jurors for jury duty for homicide cases and things like this, it was lottery. Why? The idea was that any citizen could be a member of this, and it didn't want to have picking people. It was going to be random. As long as they were fellow citizens, your fellow citizens judged you and would determine the cases. In fact, this is even went in common law, in the Anglo-Saxon common law tradition. This went even further, not only for homicides and crimes, what juries insisted on, but also civil trials, civil disputes. In other words, disputes between business, lawsuits and things like this. The difference in this is that in a civil case, you only have to have a majority of the jury. In a criminal case, you need all 12 jurors to agree with the conviction. If one juror says innocent, then there's no guilty verdict. And that's how that works. The system is weighted to protect and to secure the rights of the subject. So therefore, that's why we have to understand the importance of the jury. What is meant by judicial independence and by Montesquieu in that sense, and why did it preserve liberty? Number 12, there is no connect. No, here it is. Number 11, Montesquieu thought it was a good idea to unify all functions and powers of government unified in one branch or institution. No, that was the worst thing. That's despotic. That's inefficient. And if one branch of office does everything, this will be inefficient, and it also will tend to be despotic. In fact, the argument was that you should never allow the executive and legislative to be the same. Because there would never be a check. If the legislative and executive were the chain, there would be never a check on the executive. The executive could get away with whatever the majority of the legislature would want it to look at. Again, that's the famous classic critique. And then number 12, there's no connection between the various offices and their arrangements in the character of regime. Again, that is false. There is always there is a connection between how the offices and their agreements and with the character of the regime. In other words, the offices and how they're arranged will be connected to the character of the regime. In other words, the offices and how they're arranged are a fundamental character of what shapes a given political regime. 13, total participation by all citizens are only possible in a small scale political parties. Total participation by all citizens are only possible in small scale political parties. And that's true. That's true. 14, system of representation were designed to help overcome the problem of political participation in large or vast, both in terms of either population or of size of territory, of political communities. And that again is true. Judicial power is about lawmaking, false. Judicial power is not about lawmaking, it's about adjudicating, settling disputes, or in other words, there's a dispute about the law and that the judicial branch settles the dispute about the law. It doesn't make law. When it makes law, it's no longer acting as a judiciary branch, it's acting legislatively. And that is the crux of the 2 weeks of quizzes. We're up to the thing. I think we have next week, or we have a quiz next week, and then we move on to, because this will deal with today's material on regime change and things like this. Now, today's topic is supposed to be regime change. We're kind of late, but regime change is very straightforward. In other words, starting with the Aristotle's Politics, Book 5 reading, and also with the Tilly reading, because that's what most of the readings today were from. The readings for today was mostly from Book 5 of the Politics and Tilly, Charles Tilly's Chapter 6.
Can I have a question before we start?
Yeah.
So when we miss a quiz, we just get 0 points from it?
Well, if it's like what happened today, since they came, they did it, and and they didn't have the answer. I didn't give the answers yet, therefore I could let them make them up. But if you,
Yeah, if it was a long time.
yeah, so that it's mostly 0, and what will happen is that you'll get a. There will be I have to think about this. If you have a valid medical excuse for the thing, I might set up make a what do you call a extra credit quiz for people who have valid medical reasons, and they need extra points because they missed a quiz or two. But again, that's just the case. And if you're absent from a quiz or missed it, you get 0 points. Okay. Those are that. Now let me go to the question here. Basically the structure of chapter 1, he goes into a very specific thing with a 4-point aspect, gives a structure, and this is what brings about change or revolution in regime. How many are they? How many forms of change or variations, of what sort are they? In other words, what are the things that bring change within the regime? The sources or destructions of each regime. Why does each regime will destroy itself or fall apart? Okay, and then to which sort of regime it most particularly transform into. So what is the trend of how a regime transform into? And then last but not least, third is, what are the sources and preservations of both regimes in common, but also for separately, and then also further, by what things each sort of regime might particularly be preserved by. What are specific things that could preserve regimes? What specific actions can be done to preserve regimes, to reserve a specific thing? So therefore, we have certain kind of questions about the character of this. The division and varies of each regime emerges out of a disagreement regarding justice, which is connected to the issues of equality and inequality. In other words, the different forms of regime emerge out of different views concerning justice. Okay, first of all, there's each regime type holds a different conception of justice. Therefore, even within a type regime, there's going to be people who disagree with the view of justice, that is the justice, understanding of justice upheld by the regime. They have in other words, every community is going to have people with different opinions about the just and the unjust. Okay, usually what happens is that in a regime, the regime educates and inculcates people to believe the authoritative view. Okay. In other words, the laws are the given regime's views, opinions, authoritative opinions, also with teeth, with arms behind it, the force of the regime, about what justice is about in that regime. Okay, and this is what the civic education reinforces, and most people learn to. Most people will believe. But in a society, there's going to be different people from different groups who have different economic interests, and because of this, this may lead them to have different understandings of what is just. Okay, the classic distinction is between the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy are going to be more likely to be arrogant. The poor are going to be more envious. Therefore, their envy will lead them to want what others have, and therefore their jealousy will lead them to more equality, where the rich, having their wishing to preserve what they have, and also wish to maintain their control and believe that they should rule, they should be obeyed, will tend to act in the regime trying to limit the people's influence, okay? So both sides will try to, the people will, the democratic classes will try to expand their control, and the elites and the oligarchs will try to restrain control in the regime, okay? This is the two dynamics that happen. Now he says that now there's, change in the system has a fourfold character. He says change occurs in two ways. Stasis, now this is the Greek word here, stasis means conflict. It means, the Greek word literally means to stand up. To make like, you're going to stand up firm, that you're not going to let anyone do this. In other words, the idea, there's another word for stasis, means frozen. Well, if here the stasis means like factional conflict. You're going to have a situation where you're not going to allow, in other words, you're not going to just let everyone, you're going to cause problems because you disagree. You disagree and you're going to make your disagreement known with the society at large. You're going to agitate. It might be, stasis can have many forms, okay? It can be just, you're grumpy and agitated, you're angry, and you mumble, and you talk and gripe and complain to other people, and you gossip, and you complain like this. That's a low-level stasis. High-level stasis is when people get violent. And stasis at the extreme level is extreme violence. That there's no longer, in other words, the violence is so strong that there's no order left. So there's this range from, yes, there is this weak level agitation, unhappiness with the order, resistance to the order, and it's usually kind of weak resistance and mostly kind of rumbling and anger, griping, and verbal abuse, verbal attacking, things like this, to action, then to violence. Okay, you know what I'm saying? This is the scale of what stasis can become. Stasis is not simply stasis. In other words, some people have read stasis as, or they understand stasis. Some modern writers understand stasis as civil war. Okay, they would say it's automatic. Anytime you have stasis, it's civil war. Any disagreement is civil war or contention. Radical contention. And the problem here is that the ancients understood this as more of a scale. A scale from the mild form of, it's still a negative. In other words, in other words, stasis is a lack of harmony. In other words, when everything is running smoothly and everyone's agreeing, the structure, the community, and the political system is harmonious. Where all the parts feel that their benefits they're getting their just good in other words, they're benefiting from the goods of the system, and they think the distribution of the goods in the system are relatively fair. Not necessarily perfect. They might want more, but it's good enough, or it's acceptable. And they're not necessarily adverse to the structure. Here, what happens is that what happens now is that there comes resistance, okay? Now, in other words, change occurs in two ways. Stasis with a view towards the regime, in other words, that is from one type of regime to another, for example, democracy into oligarchy and from oligarchy to democracy, or from these into a regime of or aristocracy. From the middle class, this regime called regime, or aristocracy, or from the fields of other on. So the first thing that changes from one type of regime to another change, right? You go from one type to another type, from oligarchy, democracy, oligarchy, or from either oligarchy that to regime or to aristocracy. With a two, with a view of not of changing the regime, but bringing the regime into their hands. In other words, I'm a group. One group within one faction within the city gets control of the system. It doesn't change the regime, but there's a change of those in the ruling body. In other words, that which is given a ruling element of the regime, which holds the regime offices and be ruling body, the platoon, they say. That is to say, that this person or group gains power over another person or group. Okay, in other words, this is the other way. So the second type of stasis is someone getting power. Like what happens when the new government gets power, right? The election happens and the opposite party gets power, right? That's a change. This is a form of regime change in that setting. Okay, this is an aspect of change. So change happens. This kind of big changes not only between regimes, but also within who's governing the governing body. What party or group? There's a change of who's running the governing body. 3, stasis regarding more or less tightening or loosening the regime, especially democracy or oligarchy, where there is a change from one variety of democracy and oligarchy to another. In other words, there's a change within the regime. In other words, democratic regimes become more and more expanding who can become a participant, and oligarchic regimes are constricting who can become a participant. Okay, so therefore the type of democratic regime will vary. Okay, and last but not least, changing the part and office of the regime. For example, to establish or abolish a certain office. Some assert that Lysander tried to eliminate the kingship at Sparta, and King Panasa held the board of overseers, and Epidamus, too, the Politeia was altered partially. A council replaced the tribal officers. But it is still compulsory only for those of the Politeia who hold the office to come to the hall when there is voting for an office. And the single supreme office was also an oligarchic feature of that regime. Okay, that's the example. I'm giving the example of 2 places. One was what happened in Sparta, and the second one was what happens with Epidamus, that is Thebes. What happened in Thebes? Okay, in other words, how the Theban regime changed. What happens? This changes changing institution. An office or institution has been changed. Like what would happen tomorrow if you change the construction of the court? In other words, instead of the law changed the court construction. They said instead of having the judicial board appoint the judges, the legislature will appoint the judges. The parliament would do it. That would be a change. This would be a kind of political regime change in that sense. A small change in that sense. So that's the 4 kind of fall forward character of regime change. Now we need to talk about for a second about how regime, in other words, the relationship between revolution and regime change. In other words, every revolution is a form of regime change, okay? But not every regime change is a revolution. Hence back to this, in other words, the change of a part is not necessarily revolution. Or the change of, maybe even this, that maybe even the change of one party ruling, like 3 and 4, 2 and 4 are not necessarily perceived as a revolution. Sometimes it could be. In other words, the question is how radical is a change? How much the popular perceives it as a change. If the popular just doesn't view it as a major change, it's not really revolutionary. So therefore, what we have here is that in other words, revolutions are a form of political change, but they're the extreme, they're radical. And now we have to understand, regime change can happen both internally within a political community itself or imposed upon a political community from outside foreign actors. Revolutions, however, a domestic internal within a given political community, formal changing of government from one regime to another. In other words, revolution is always an internal matter. The system is overturning itself. Regime change can happen both internally and external forces can be imposed on it. In other words, there is a situation where you can have an external power force you to change a regime. Okay? Usually after a war. The Allied powers conquered Germany and it forced it to give up the regime that was in power and forced it to become a democratic regime. Same thing, it did the same thing to Japan. It forced a democratic constitution on it, right? Outside forces compelled change of the political system. Radical change of the political system. Okay? So the political change, regime change can happen both internally and externally. Revolutions only happen internally. And another thing I should put about revolutions. Today, when we think of revolutions, we think of revolutions as revolution not only of the political system, but of the society. This is particularly the case when we talk about, let's say, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. This was, in other words, this is the difference between, let's say, the American Revolution and the French and the Russian Revolution. The American Revolution did not overturn the society per se. It only overturned the structures of control and ruling. It declared its independence, and it removed those loyal to the crown to those who were going to be loyal to the nation itself. Okay, no longer subjects but citizens. The revolution did not. In some ways, it did have some social change, but it wasn't going to be like in the sense of total destruction of the society. Like the French Revolution radically overturned class structures, institutions, structures, social dimensions. And the Russian Revolution similarly. In other words, these are total revolutions, not only of the state or of the regime, but also of the society itself. So today, when we think about revolutions, we think of total revolutions. These are very rare. They're more extreme. Most political revolutions are just merely political in character, from one character. And you can say, there's two, that they're usually vertical. A lot of regimes, revolutions happen, they say horizontal or vertical. Vertical revolutions tend to be, let's see, always confuse vertical and horizontal. Horizontal is lying down. A horizontal revolution usually means that one level like this, it's between different levels. Most revolutions in Latin America were really vertical, in the sense that there was from one group over here to one group over here, not from the lower group up to in charge up here. So therefore, it's just actually changes of elites controlling the system. Now, this is the famous thing, causes. What are the causes? What are the causes and beginning point? I use the word Greek here because this is Aristotle, aretai. These are the reasons why revolution, change happens, and also factional conflict happen. What are the causes of them? What are the starting points, triggering things, the beginning points of it? Okay. Now he says the first thing we do is we grasp the conditions men are in when they engage in stasis or civil conflict. This is the material clause. For the state, now this is the famous thing. Aristotle had, in his physics and his science, argued that there was four causes. Causes can be understood in four ways. The material cause, the formal or pudding cause. The formal cause is the formal shape. Then it was called efficient, but the efficient really means pudding. In other words, sequence. What was the thing that happened before it? What was the immediate cause of the thing? The thing that happened just before the sequence. And then last, the final cause or teleological cause, which was what is the purpose or end or reasoning that it did what it did. Okay. So therefore, these are the four classical causes. Now, in this section of this thing, he talks about, well, the first condition is to grasp what condition men are in and why they engage in it. That's the first question that you ask. This is to understand the material cause. What are the conditions of men or the political system? What are the conditions? Two, for what sake do they do so, engage in stasis? In other words, why are they doing it? That's, again, final cause or teleological. What the purposes or reasoning why people do things. And last, what is the beginning points of the political disturbances and of stasis? In other words, what is the beginning points of the conflict, of factional conflict? What causes the conflict? What incident or thing that does it? Now, therefore, these three things are divided in certain ways. Here he begins to look at this from, like, we're looking at the conditions of men. Who are they? What are the conditions? Well, one thing we look at, well, poverty, wealth and poverty, equality and inequality, right? That's the clearest one. The question of who are they? But also, this is another question. You can look at it from the point of view of, okay, not only the condition, but also, I don't put that in there, but also if they're the same people or not. I mean, are they a people? Are they one people? Are they multiple people? In other words, how do they see themselves as a group or not? What's going on here? In other words, what is the entity you're looking at? What is the material entity you're looking at? What is it composed of? What is the reality of it? What is the structures of it? What is the things that composed of it? And of course, their conditions. Again, it's like wealthy, not wealthy. Do they have, what is their means of their sustenance? And whether they can, is it possible for everyone to achieve sustenance easy? Or is there, or only a few can provide and many are just dependent, okay? On other, they can only, in other words, there's no, the sources of resources are few, and therefore few own the resources, and most have to labor for the few in order to live, okay? These are kind of classic constructions of, this is why to grasp the conditions men are in when they engage in stasis or conflict. This is the material cause. In other words, here we look at the various parts or groups within the given political community. We have to look at the elites and the notables, the multitude, and the other populations and groups. You have to look at the groups, who they are, what are the reasons for them. Do they have enough resources? Do they see themselves benefiting from the system or not benefiting from the system? All of this is the material cause of this. And then last, we look at the location and place where the political community is situated, the conditions and situation regarding resources and its neighbors. The environment, right? The environment it's constructed in. In other words, does it have good resources or it doesn't have? Does it have bad? Is the neighborhood? Are the neighboring cities and communities? Are they right there and threatening them? Are they going to be always threatened, or are they dependent upon the others? Do they get their resources from those other states? In other words, what is the relationship of the situation? The international situation and also the domestic situation. Where is the location, where it is, what is the conditions of resources, how they're situated. And things like rivers. In other words, trust me, if you don't have a good situation of geography, if your geography is horrible, then look, China has probably the worst geography in the world. Why?
Mountains.
Mostly mountains. And what else? Not much land, arable land, very little limited land that can grow food. It has very much mountains. Are there rivers really navigable? Yes, somewhat. I mean, the worst rivers, the places that have the worst rivers is Latin America. The Amazon River is a disaster. It's a big, powerful river, but is it navigable? No. It's briefly navigable, but then there's 1,000 feet gaps between the different areas, okay? You have these huge waterfalls and things like that. And you can't go, your ships can't go in up there. The same thing with the Nile is pretty good. It goes to a certain, but then at a certain level, the Nile kind of peters out and it becomes another part. The rest of Africa, the rivers are disasters, right? There's not really good rivers. Likewise. Okay, why is that important? Trust me. Anywhere that has good rivers, you had economic development. Anywhere you had good rivers, you had economic development. The first initial economic development always tied around rivers. Places that had very stable, navigable rivers. One of the reasons, Poland had a problem because why? Because the Vistula is a bastard. It's the most, it's not a stable, come on, just think, you know how much, in 200, 300 years, you know how much the Vistula moved? Go look at the bridge sometime, how big that bridge, this big center bridge, how long it is, how long it has to be, because that's how much the river moved over a period of 3 to 4 centuries. Okay? So therefore, if you understand that, right, you understand why where German rivers, the Rhine, the Oder, these rivers are stable, big. You go look at or England, the internal rivers within England, they're very stable. And they very much allow for mass commerce in trade in the Middle Ages. So therefore, this explains why a lot of reality of this. Now, why, for the sake they do engage in stasis, the final telecause. Now, in other words, Aristotle here asks that which motivates human beings to act. Now, Aristotle offers a complex model or psychology, one that can be found in his ethical writings. In other words, why do you, and there's also his rhetoric too. In other words, there is the psychology here. What is the psychology of why actors act? Their motivations. What are the reasoning and motivations? Now, he argues there's at least 3 levels. And it goes from the low to the high. We go low, it's profit loss. Actually, this is the famous thing. One is it's passion. In other words, one is materialistic. The other is tied to spirit, man's spiritedness, and the third is tied to his virtues. In other words, the best in man. So what is this? This is the first condition that needs man to do what they do. This is what? This is tied to material conditions of profit and loss. Utility and its opposite. People choose to pursue what is their benefit, what benefits them. It's what is their good. See, the 3 meanings of good. Good means benefit, utility. Good also means what? Or the question of honor and dishonor, right? Your good is your status and your reputation. When people will act for reasons of money or profit and loss, right? But also people will act because of status and reputation. In fact, Thurston Veblen, in his famous book, Theory of the Leisure Class, makes the argument is that people act more for status seeking than interest seeking, economic interest. Why then? Why do you guys buy brands and have the brand? Why do you give free? Why do you walk around with the brand on your heads and in your shirts and things? Status seeking. Showing that you're rich, or showing in other words, you buy the expensive traditional bands to show that you're in the affluent class. You're part of the middle affluent class. It's in other words, it's a symbolic virtue signaling to showing your status. And virtue signaling is very much, human beings signal their virtue and their class status.
Well, it's supposed to do that, but considering that the people from lower classes seek to cover themselves with brands, they sometimes buy knockoffs, even if they're good knockoffs.
But it's obvious.
People start knowing that if you wear branded things, they're probably knockoffs, and then that makes
it becomes a new. Yes, exactly. This becomes a kind of reinforcing situation, though. In other words, the very rich won't wear brands in that same way. The very rich there's a difference. I mean, the very rich who wear tattered jeans, That's because they wore the same jeans for 15 years, right? Or they drove the same car for 20 years, okay? Rich people don't spend money on things. They wear the same clothes for years and years and years. They buy good clothes, they buy expensive clothes that last forever, okay? Most brand stuff you buy today, don't last a year, 2 years after you wash it, right? Falls apart. So therefore, you'd have to, this is the irony about this. So therefore, this is a way, because they know that this is how people get rich, because they know people want to improve their status symbols changing, businesses will sell these clothing brands, I say profiting on the desire of lower status people to signal higher status. It's preying on their desire for more status. In other words, you're envious not only of money, you're also envious of status. People can be envious of status. And we virtue signal. Again, it's left with virtue. The last condition is the virtue. Justice and injustice. In fact, the biggest divide is between the just and the unjust. In other words, every political system has a view of justice, right? Therefore, there is a justice in the system. And that view of justice has authority. And those who support the regime will enhance that view of judgment. And those who reject the regime usually will have their competing view of justice in charge of that. Again, justice and injustice, vice and virtue will be the biggest engine that divides why we engage. If you think the regime is unjust, right? If you think it's unjust or that it's vicious, you will fight it, you will act against the regime. So your motivation to act against the regime or to force change is what? It's not material, it's not honor necessarily, but it can be based upon virtue, your perception of virtue. So these are the reasons why people engage things. Now these leads us to the famous, this is the two accounts, it's hilarious. The 7 and 11, they call it the 7. He gives 7, then he gives 11. The 7, 11. These are the beginning points, or the arche, the beginning points of political disturbances and of stasis of conflict. Or these are the efficient or moving causes. Now, these two lists, in other words, the situations gain or profit. The first list, gain or profit, honor, or reverence, violence. In other words, some violence was done, panic or flight or fear. Fifth is projection or prominence, contain or disdain. Sixth, 7, disproportionate growth. So that's the first 7, and now these 4 come. These are laboring for wages or electioneering, may say, seeking public offices, those who want to seek public offices. An estimation, an esteeming lightly or underestimation, smallness or small things, and dissimilarity or unlikeliness. These are the first account. Now what happens is he switch places. The second account he gives arrogance first, arrogance and offense. So what can cause a fight? Easily. Someone gives offense to someone else. Particularly, let's say, in the ruling offices. One of the members of the elites, and usually this happens at the elite level, right? One way it can happen is one guy dishonors another guy. I mean, come on. Isn't this the Tusk-Kaczynski fight? The fact that these two people hate each other because they feel that there was arrogance against them, or some sense of arrogance of one guy against the other, or something. And therefore they despise the other person because of this, and therefore all the political fight between PO and PIS, and between particularly the Tusk division of PO and Kaczynski, is all about this sense of arrogance and both sides thinking the other side is arrogant and aggrandizing itself against itself. Or it can even be between classes. Come on, look how the elite, think of how the urban elite treats the rest of society. how they look down upon them, how they have contempt for them, right? This is arrogance. This can cause resentment. And this causes the conflict. In other words, how the elites behave towards the other, the multitude. Their arrogance can be the cause of the fact. Their arrogance by one part over the other part, resentment. So arrogance can be done this, offensiveness. Second is gain of profit. In other words, economic. Profit or loss, economic harm, economic things. That one group benefits and the other group doesn't. This can be cause for a dispute. In other words, honor. Honors are given to some, or reverence is given to some, but not others. You give someone honor. This leads to jealousy. Other people get angry, want to take that person down. Projection or permanence. One person is so presented as important, therefore everyone else wants to tear them down. Okay. Contempt or disdain. To have contempt. If I have contempt for you, this will cause me to act against you. Or if I show you disdain, you may get angry and want to act against me. Okay, you understand? So this is another cause of why this is a triggering event that leads to why there is conflict. Why actors will act against each other. Disproportionate growth. Okay, that's even interesting. What happens when one part of the society grows bigger than the other part of society? It changes the nature. In other words, when societies had larger agrarian populations than rural populations, but then all of a sudden it flipped. The rural population started to outnumber the rural population. What happens? This is a conflict. This is a change of this disproportionate growth of one part of a community over another part can lead to conflict. Because the new part wants more power. The part that has grown will say, well, we're bigger now. We should have more say. More control. And that may actually change the regime. They're having more say and more control. Electioneering. Come on, election disputes. One party coming into office by running. This person running for office can cause everyone to be so angry that they will try to stop him. Okay, you understand? Come on, Trump! Think about that. Think of how Trump, just the thought of Trump drives some people completely insane. Politically. You understand that? No, you understand that, don't you? That is a kind of electioneering. That's someone I'm elect. In other words, this is how people running for political office, people running for how they run for political office can cause in other words, people seeking to get political power. Remember what's happening. Remember, change of rule of the ruling offices is a form of change. Can be sometimes seen as revolution. So therefore, those who cause dispute because they're challenging the status quo, because they're running for office to challenge the status quo, this is a form of conflict that leads to revolution or change. Estimating lightly or underestimating again, and then small things. Okay, small things. This is a great. Actually, it's chapter 4, book 3. Read it. It's hilarious. It's usually about sex. That you remember. There's a famous joke about this. Some of the biggest fights will happen among couples will not happen because the fights that really start the most violent will be over about toilet paper or about not using coasters, right? But the problem is that's not really the fight. The fight is about other things. The small dispute about toilet paper or about a coaster using or something like that, the small thing will merely be the trigger which allows the larger dispute to come out and play. Okay? So therefore, small things are very important. It's about in the book 4. It's hilarious. About I don't have the text, but it's about not honoring somebody's promising to marry, promising to have your son marry, promising your daughter to someone to be married into someone else, but instead give her to someone else. Okay, so that therefore the jilted party feels resentful. Okay, and they will seek to, and the resentment caused by that act will be the instant reason, the thing that divides the ruling party. Two brothers fighting over the same girl can lead to a divide within the ruling government or the ruling thing that can cause a factional conflict that divides the given political system. Small things can cause big things, not because the small things are important, but because they are they can be a trigger, which then other disputes will then reveal themselves. And last but not least, the dissimilarities he gives. He expands it there of what, not all the same stock. In other words, what happens if your population has change of stock population? What happens your society, all of a sudden the ethnic population totally changes? This will cause factional conflict and political dispute. I mean, you know, if you know the history of the Second Polish Republic, and currently, the Second Polish Republic had lots of ethnic problems because of the different ethnic groups: Ukrainians, Lithuanians, a population, and including elements of the German population that were in Poland at the time. That divided their ethnic differences led to political parties that did it, and that divided and that caused a lot of political conflict in the early Second Republic, after restored Poland, after the First World War to the Second World War. But then what happened was Stalin ethnically cleansed, and that you were the most 90-something% Polish. So there was no more ethnic conflict, right? They ethnically cleansed the German population. They moved the German population out. They moved your borders a little bit this way. You took some German land. They kicked the Germans out. They kicked them out. They moved you from Ukrainian and Russian lands into Poland proper. And then what happens? You became a more homogeneous population. So therefore, change or similarity of stock is one form of dissimilarity. In other words, there's the stock. Then what? If equality, dissimilarity because of equality. What happens when all of a sudden people become too rich? What happens when all of a sudden the middle class becomes a lot of rich people? That changes, in other words, that dissimilarity of the situation changes the political dynamic. Then the other thing is location, the change of location. What happens? What happens if a river changes or something happens that leads to a change of the geography of your situation? Or because you had to move from one place to another place. Now, dissimilarity causes problems. Because the people who used to living a certain way now are no longer able to live. I mean, this happens in a lot of places. The similarity of the land because of environmental degradation or change or pollution. In other words, this will change the lands that used to be, people used to be able to live off the land, no longer not able to live off the land because the land has been polluted because of the downstream economic activity. So the location, in other words, locations can force, the changes or effects on the location can change the situation of the people there, and it can create reasons for disunity. A split between vice and virtue. In other words, the difference between, in other words, again, this is the likeness or likeness. The biggest gap of thing is the difference between vice and virtue. In other words, the biggest thing of the biggest dissimilarity between people is between those who obey the rules and those who disobey the rules. Those who engage in who challenge a system of breaking the law. Okay, that's another thing. Virtue and vice. And then the last lactation is he says it last, but again, it points about this between the wealthy and poverty. In fact, that's always the funny thing about in the Greek. It is actually in the words themselves. The root word for both wealthy and poverty is the same word. Prior means resources. The wealthy are eu puria. That means those who have lots of resources. Eu means well, or good. Eunomia, good governance. Eu prioria means wealthy. Lots. In other words, eminent amount of things. Now, the poor are what? A prior. Apios. That means what? Without. A alpha means primitive, without the resources. Now, again, this is a small thing, chapter 4, where he talks about the small things. He gives them to this. He gives 6 examples where some small event leads to cause of regimes. He usually deals with elites, the wealthy and notables, important people in the regime. Again, he then expands on the question of growth and size. In other words, the size of the ruling part. What happens when the governing body, the ruling part, increases or decreases? That will change the regime, or that cause conflict. Then sudden drastic change in the size of the part of a community. And then the last part is this question of force, fraud, and consent. Okay? This is the ending of chapter 4 of the Politics 5. Has this wonderful discussion about the difference between he distinguishes between the things that were done at the beginning and then later on. And he says there's 3 ways we can go about something. I can get you to agree or accept something by what? Persuasion. I can persuade. No, I want you to do something, right? I want you to do something. And we're going to begin this, right? We're going to begin I can persuade you to do it. I can fraud is con you. In other words, fraud is lie to you, and by lying to you, what? You agree to do something. I con you, right? Fraud. And then the next stage is I use force on you. You do it because if you don't, I'm gonna beat you up or kill you. Okay? Those are, in other words, what is that story from The Godfather? I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. Well, this is again, so therefore in the beginning you can have what? You can have either persuading, decept, or coercion. But then what happens? Well, then there is what happens when you have to, in the middle of the thing, what happens? Later on, how do you maintain it? Well, you can maintain it either, again, by these 3 conditions. You can persuade people, you can lie to them, or you can coerce them, force them. So therefore, there's now we have a matrix here. A matrix of 3 possible starting things and 3 possible outcomes afterwards. In other words, you can start by persuasion, but then later use coercion or fraud. Or maybe you can use persuasion again. In other words, every stage in the action of a political decision, these 3 things. Now, what's interesting here, Aristotle seems to say fraud is okay. See, what's interesting about Machiavelli thinks this. This is the most Machiavellian part of one of the most Machiavellian parts of Aristotle's politics. Because Machiavelli makes this famous thing: what does the prince must do? Force and fraud. The 2 most important skills of the prince is force and fraud. Princes, powerful people get power through force and fraud. That's Machiavelli. Aristotle says, no, there's a 3rd persuasion. You can persuade them. Machiavelli says, persuasion is, what is the distinction between conning people and persuading them? Not much. It's seduction. Seduction. Seduction at one level appears voluntary, but at another level is involuntary. Seduction is like fraud in that sense. Promising you one thing but delivering something else. Okay? So therefore, this is the problem of this conception. That all political, but therefore this also explains why, given this reality, political leaders have different levels of contention because of this. What was done by fraud, you can sometimes then resolve by what? Sometimes you usually, once people, in other words, if you've been lied to and done it, right? My response there is I can continue the fraud, but once the fraud has been exposed, people are either going to care or not care. If they don't care, then you can persuade them to do it. Keep on doing it. You don't have to use coercion. But when they care, you either have to persuade them or con them again, or con them differently, but still con them, or you have to use coercion. So therefore, this is the structure of how we understand this thing. Now, this is that famous democracy problem. The democracy goes from the first democracy. This is the 4 accounts of democracy, right? First democracy, where it's the very much open things. This is that. 2 weeks ago, we had 2 classes ago, we had the different accounts of democracy and oligarchy, right? The first, second, third types, based on the type of multitudes and the size of the multitude. And the versus the last democracy is one where there's no rule of law. It's people. It's everyone can participate, and it is the rule of it is whatever they want is what the rule is. Law doesn't exist. It's whatever they decree is the law. And that he says, listen, at this level, oligarchy goes this way. In other words, democracy goes ever expanding the control of who participates, right? And oligarchy goes the opposite way, ever decreasing as it goes down from the different things. The oligarchies are here sometimes wider and very similar to the democracies here. In other words, these 2 things are the same, ironically. Now the size is different, but the reality would be probably similar in that sense. The first democracy and the first oligarchy are very similar to each other. Then what happens as it increases, the oligarchies constrict it totally, and then last is here, around here, is that all of a sudden the selection is within families. The fathers replace sons. No new, in other words, the size of the oligarchy shrinks completely, and then who gets replaced? Sons replace fathers. The dynastic structures. And then the last is the dynastic oligarchy, where there's only the rulers will rules. Now these 2, the last democracy and the last oligarchy, I say democracy, that's a mistake. Last oligarchy is what? These are like tyrannies. There's a mistake here. This is last democracy, last tyranny, last oligarchy. These 2 things are very tyrannical. He says that right back in previous 2 weeks ago. Now this is the change. The change will go from either this way to this way. That's one way of change. This way, this way. It changes this way by what? As the democratic process expands who participates in democracy. Democracies, and if they restrict or kind of restrain it, it does it. Now oligarchy does that in the opposite situation. And therefore that's why it's the way it is. Regime change goes this way, it works in a weird way. This is the classic argument, goes in the cycle. That's not what Aristotle says, doesn't happen. It's not this simple cycle of things. Rather, regimes can go into any other type of regimes. There's no clear pattern. There is some tendencies. The big tendency is oligarchies, democracies and oligarchies go this way. Kingships always tend to devolve into either oligarchies or democracies. Tyrannies, kingships democracies and oligarchies devolve into tyranny through different ways, but they can devolve into tyranny, and that this one doesn't tend to exist. Here is the famous structure of a regime, the ruling element, the outpouring, so this is extraction, coercion in that sense, of trying to maintain itself. The inputs are demands and support, exports is action. So this is the cycle, this is the political environment by which political action occurs within the regime, and how the system of response and active response operates. This is another version of that same model. The regime is here, the regime structure, this is the government, the regime is the certain circle, the outside the regime is the environment outside. These boxes are different groups or actors, and then some are within these actors are within the regime and how they support the regime. This box is the government, but these are the regime members, and these are people inside the political system but outside the regime, and therefore these are contesters to a system. And these are things, again, are completely outside. These are the limits of government jurisdiction here, right? And here, these are completely outside actors. These are challengers inside the regime, and these usually are completely outside actors who are outside the scope of state action. Going back to the Tilly model, the variations of the regime, the four zones, what he says, the zone of fragmented tyranny, the zones of authoritarianism, and the zones of citizenship. In other words, these zones here form us a scape of this. So here is the governmental capacity, and here's levels of democratic inclusivity. And that therefore we can say, by testing these different levels, we can see regimes over time switching into these areas and the risks they do. Here's a conflict, this is the conflict resolution situation, transfers of power and split in regime. No split in regime, complete change, complete transfer of power, none. This is the scope of normal politics, right? This is routine politics. Here is coups, here's top-down seizures of powers, here's civil wars, here's the Great Revolution, here's just revolts. So we have nice structural model to see how contesting, how is the transport of power, how much of that? We just have to get a scale of this and the split in the regime. Is it no split in the regime complete or total split in the regime? In other words, therefore, we have, these are the ways, the structure of, we can see the different types of change. And that's how we end the class. So, good day, see you guys next week.